Israel formally withdrew in November 2005. That's what, and there was an agreement, a truce agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It said that the Palestinian Authority would take over Gaza. It would refrain from terror. Israel would open the borders from Gaza to Israel. The borders would be open to Egypt. They would establish a seaport in Gaza. They would reconstruct the airport that Israel had destroyed. Those were the essential terms of the peace agreement. And that's been repeated over and over, so it's worth looking at closely. That was November. In January, 2 months later, the Palestinians committed a major crime. They had a free election, first free election in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair, but they made a mistake. They voted for the wrong people. Hamas won the election. Israel immediately instituted, had harsh reprisals. The attacks, which had never ended, just picked up. There were an embargo was imposed, blocking goods in and out. The United States went further. It turned to its standard operating procedure when a free election goes the wrong way, started organizing a military coup. Things continued to escalate. The Palestinians carried out a second crime. They preempted the military coup. You don't do that. If the United States is planning to overthrow a government, you don't preempt the coup and stay in power. So the attacks escalated. I won't run through the details, but there's a standard procedure that's gone on since 2005. A truce accord is established. Hamas lives up to it. Israel violates it, never keeps up to it. Finally, Israel escalates its violation. That elicits some kind of Hamas reaction. That's the pretext for the next act of what Israel calls mowing the lawn, another major attack, each one worse than the last. The 51-day war was the worst so far. That's the regular procedure. Then comes the Western propaganda, just following Israeli hasbara, exactly what you reported. Poor Israel is attacked by rockets. What can they do? They have to defend themselves.
So I want us to watch this incredible interview by Noam Chomsky and how he explained the whole problem between Israel and Palestine, and how sometimes people from the West have been the problem why Israel and Palestine cannot have peace. So let's watch the interview, and please let us know your take in the comment section below. So let's get on with it.
Many of the world's problems are so intractable that it's hard to think of ways even to take steps to mitigate them. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not one of these. Professor Chomsky, these are your words. The general outlines of a diplomatic solution have been clear for at least 40 years. Why has this diplomatic solution not come to fruition?
Well, we can begin 40 years ago. In January 1976, the three major Arab states, so-called confrontation states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, approached the United Nations Security Council with a resolution which they submitted, calling for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border with guarantees for the right of each of the two states, Israel and new Palestinian state, with their right to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. Israel refused to attend the session. It gratuitously bombed Lebanon for no known reason other maybe than to show its contempt for the Security Council, killing maybe 50 people. The United States vetoed the resolution. Same thing happened in 1980. U.S. vetoed a similar resolution. The since the U.S. was not going to allow anything to pass the Security Council, debate shifted to the General Assembly, where there are regular resolutions almost every year, with varying slightly, but with fundamentally a similar content. Votes are something like 151 to 2, United States, Israel, sometimes the Marshall Islands or someone. This rarely even gets reported. The most recent U.S. veto actually did get reported because it was so strange. This is Obama, February 2011, vetoed a resolution at the Security Council calling for the implementation of official U.S. policy. Official U.S. policy is that there should be no expansion of the settlements, the illegal settlements. It's a kind of a marginal issue. The real issue is the settlements, not their further expansion. Security Council called for a ban on expansion of the settlements, and also repeated what is not dubious, that the settlements are illegal. That's been determined by every relevant international body. The U.S. vetoed it, so that was strange enough so that it did get a little notice. But the reason why it's not implemented is straightforward. Israel is opposed. The United States supports it.
Can you talk a little bit, you often refer to the double veto. What is it that you mean when you talk about a double veto?
Well, let's take the January 76 veto, which is quite important. It's doubly vetoed in the sense that the resolution is vetoed, and it's vetoed from history. So try to find it in media reporting, even in scholarship. Occasionally you'll find some oblique reference in a detailed scholarly work, and that's systematic. So, for example, in the early days of the United Nations, the United States was so overwhelmingly dominant in the world that the United Nations simply supported anything the U.S. wanted to do. And the United Nations was very popular among U.S. elites. It supported U.S. policy. The U.S. used it as a kind of a weapon against Russia, so the Russians kept vetoing things. You look back, there are scholarly discussions back in the early 50s as to why the Russians are so negative. Why do they keep saying no all the time? One proposal from distinguished anthropologist was that they raise their children in swaddling clothes, so they become very negative since childhood. By the mid-60s, the United Nations had become much more diverse. Other countries had reconstructed from wartime damage, decolonization proceeded, and it was no longer reliably under the U.S. lash. At that point, the United States started vetoing resolutions. First one was in 1970, when the U.S. joined with Britain to support the apartheid state of southern Rhodesia. And then for years, the U.S. became way in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions. Is that known? When people talk about vetoing Security Council resolutions, it means the Russians.
Right, absolutely.
Well, that's how you control history.
I talked to a lot of my colleagues, I'm a historian, but many different colleagues, and asked them, did they know that there was a pretty good peace plan, since 1976, as you've outlined? Totally unaware of this.
Even scholars and Middle East scholars don't know it.
It was just totally unbelievable. With respect to Israel and Palestine, you have argued that the U.S. should be pressured internationally and domestically to abandon its virtually unilateral role in blocking a settlement for the past 40 years, ever since the first veto in 1976. How could this be accomplished?
It's known as being the biggest thug on the block. You do what you like, and if others don't like it, too bad. In fact, the United States has many records. It's the only state that has vetoed a Security Council resolution calling on all states to observe international law. Not mentioning anyone, but it was understood that it was referring to the United States. The U.S. had just recently, before that, rejected a decision of the World Court calling on the United States to terminate what the court called its unlawful use of force, meaning international terrorism against Nicaragua. The U.S., of course, rejected the judgment. The press dismissed the World Court as irrelevant. The New York Times called it a hostile forum, so therefore we can dismiss what it concludes. Security Council did vote on a resolution calling on states to observe international law. U.S. rejected it. How many of your colleagues know that?
Yeah, I showed my students the other day peace propaganda in the Promised Land. And of course, you're in there in a lot of different places. So for the uninitiated, what is life like for Palestinians that are living under the occupation?
Since 1967, almost immediately after the 1967 war, Israel initiated a program, a systematic program, which is still underway, aimed at creating a kind of a greater Israel. The first settlements were almost immediate. First one was in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, which Israel had conquered. That was the first one, kibbutz. Then another one in the West Bank, near Hebron, then just slowly expanded. Under Shimon Peres, they expanded deep into the West Bank, what Israel calls Judea and Samaria, into Samaria. And it just goes systematically. And the idea is to take over whatever is of value in the West Bank. Gaza we could talk about, but since the idea since 2005, which is official incidentally, is to keep Gaza what's called on a diet. That was the Israeli official Dov Weissglass, who organized the withdrawal of the Israeli army, said we'll keep them on a diet, not too little food so they all starve. That won't look nice, but not enough to survive in any decent way. The purpose of the withdrawal, he said, is to ensure that there will never be any discussion of a Palestinian state.
It'll freeze the negotiations.
It'll freeze it. It puts it in formaldehyde, he said, very explicit. Mm-hmm. So Gaza, you just keep barely surviving. It's a kind of a punching bag. Anytime you want, you launch an attack and massacre people and so on. It's called defense, of course. Mm-hmm. In the West Bank, take over what you like. The contours are very clear. What's called Jerusalem is now about 5 times the size of anything that was ever historic Jerusalem. It takes over large parts of big chunks of the West Bank, including many Palestinian villages. Israel annexed it over the orders of the Security Council. That was back in '68. The U.S. at that time still supported international law on this issue. The U.S. voted with the majority. Israel annexed it anyway. Now President Trump has recognized the annexation in effect. So that's a big piece of the West Bank is what's called Jerusalem. Then there's a salient extending to the east from Jerusalem to the town of Ma'ale Adumim, which was mostly built under Clinton. And it's designed essentially to bisect the West Bank, the livable part of the West Bank. To the north, there are other salients, one going to the town of Ariel, one going to Adumim. There's what Israel calls a security barrier. Has absolutely nothing to do with security, but it has to do with annexation. So it's really an annexation barrier. Cuts through most of it, almost all of it, cuts through the West Bank, and the area to the Israeli side of the security boundary is basically integrated into Israel. Israel has slowly been taking over the Jordan Valley, large part of the arable land. There's various techniques. Usual technique is to declare a military zone where nobody's allowed to live. So you move out the Palestinians, then you move in Jewish settlers a little bit later when nobody's looking. Palestinians are left in. Meanwhile, I should say there's a huge infrastructure project developed, which means an Israeli or you or me, a visitor, can travel through the West Bank on superhighways and not know that there's a Palestinian. Or maybe we'll see a picturesque biblical scene of a shepherd with a goat somewhere up on a hill. But for the Palestinians, it means living in fairly isolated enclaves, often separated from their lands, constant severe harassment. Settlers, first of all, are just violent. They go in and kill people and so on. Recently, Israeli soldiers, repeatedly, they murder some Palestinian on some pretext, break into houses at midnight to take somebody out for interrogation, often a teenage kid. Constant or checkpoints all over the place. You never know where they're going to be. So you live under constant harassment. There is, as in neocolonial societies generally, there is a place for elites. So Ramallah is a place for Palestinian elites. It's a Western-style city. You can live pretty nicely.
I filmed there.
Yeah, you've seen there. And that's the standard you go to a poorest Central African country and find the same thing. But so that's the structure in the West Bank. The Golan Heights, Israel's just taken, again, over Security Council orders, which ordered them not to annex it, but they did anyway. And that's kind of forgotten. Gaza, as I say, is just keep it alive and keep it as a punching bag. So what's life for a Palestinian? In Gaza, literally, it's going to be uninhabitable in a few years. The World Bank and other international organizations have warned that within a few years, maybe as early as 2020, the Strip will just be uninhabitable. The West Bank, the goal is basically to have the Palestinians leave. Some may remain. Israel will take what it wants. Ultimately, it'll all be integrated. It is being integrated into Israel as a kind of a greater Israel. And the U.S. supports it, so it goes on.
I can remember in the 51-day war in Gaza, constantly I was obsessed by listening to CNN. I would hear Mark Regev, basically the PRR person, and some of the things he would say again and again, and he would chide people on CNN. And he said, you must remember we left Gaza in 2005. And I said, Israel never left for a minute. Can you talk about Israel's matrix of control in Gaza, particularly and the West Bank, so people understand that?
By 2005, Israeli hawks like Ariel Sharon realized that it makes no sense to keep a few thousand Jewish settlers in Gaza with a large part of the Israeli army protecting them, settlers using the resources of the region, agricultural, water, depleting the aquifer. It simply made no sense. It would make a lot more sense to move them from their subsidized illegal homes in Gaza to subsidized illegal homes in the West Bank. So an event was staged, a kind of a staged national trauma, to make it look as if this is some amazing withdrawal, never again, scenes of little children clinging to their homes and so on. It was all faked. In fact, it was all a repetition of what the press in Israel called National Trauma 82, when Israel staged the same trauma when they had to remove settlers from the Egyptian Sinai after the agreement with Egypt about the Sinai. And if they had wanted to withdraw simply, it was perfectly straightforward. All they had to do was inform the settlers that on such and such a day, August 1st, the IDF, the Israeli army, will be withdrawn, send lorries. The settlers would climb into the lorries. They'd be taken to their subsidized illegal homes in the West Bank. And quiet. But that way, you can't make a scene. You can't say we withdrew, never again. We've got to hang on to every inch in the West Bank and so on. Israeli commentators ridiculed that it was so transparent, but it sold in the West. It's a picture. Now, Israel never left. The occupation remains complete. Everyone, even the United States, recognizes that Gaza is occupied territory. Nobody withdrew. It's under total control. The Israeli army blocks any entry in and out. The Navy keeps fishing boats a couple of kilometers offshore, not because they're any threat, but that way they can assure that fishermen fish in highly polluted waters, polluted because Israel destroyed the sewage systems. And as Weissglass pointed out, the idea is just it's formaldehyde. We put an end to discussion of any Palestinian national rights, and we keep the population on a diet. That's for Israeli consumption. For the West, it's Mark Regev's propaganda. Incidentally, it's kind of an interesting fact about the modern Hebrew language, that there are two words for propaganda. Back 60 years ago, there used to be one word. It meant propaganda, like every other country. Now there's two words. Propaganda, same word, ta'amula, is the propaganda of other people. But Israeli propaganda is called hasbara, which means explanation. The idea being everything we do is so obviously correct that all we have to do is explain it to the goyim, and then they'll understand.
It's like an occupation of the mind as opposed to the military occupation.
Kind of.
Well, I think this opened a little segue from the same documentary, Peace, Propaganda in the Promised Land. And this is a quotation from Hussein Ibish, and I'm quoting here: Israel has always cast itself and is cast by the media as reactive, as simply responding to Palestinian aggression. Israel strikes back against terror. Israel retaliates. Israel responds. Palestinians attack. Israel retaliates. Israel's posture is anything but defensive. Could you?
Well, the history of Gaza is quite interesting in this respect. Actually, I've reviewed it in detail, as have others, so you can refer to the documentation. But the basic story is very straightforward. Israel formally withdrew in November 2005. That's what, and there was an agreement, a truce agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It said that the Palestinian Authority would take over Gaza. It would refrain from terror. Israel would open the borders from Gaza to Israel. The borders would be open to Egypt. They would establish a seaport in Gaza. They would reconstruct the airport that Israel had destroyed. Those were the essential terms of the peace agreement. And that's been repeated over and over, so it's worth looking at closely. That was November. In January, 2 months later, the Palestinians committed a major crime. They had a free election, first free election in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair, but they made a mistake. They voted for the wrong people. Hamas won the election. Israel immediately instituted, had harsh reprisals. The attacks, which had never ended, just picked up. There were an embargo was imposed, blocking goods in and out. The United States went further. It turned to its standard operating procedure when a free election goes the wrong way, started organizing a military coup. Things continued to escalate. The Palestinians carried out a second crime. They preempted the military coup. You don't do that. If the United States is planning to overthrow a government, you don't preempt the coup and stay in power. So the attacks escalated. I won't run through the details, but there's a standard procedure that's gone on since 2005. A truce accord is established. Hamas lives up to it. Israel violates it, never keeps up to it. Finally, Israel escalates its violation. that elicits some kind of Hamas reaction. That's the pretext for the next act of what Israel calls mowing the lawn, another major attack, each one worse than the last. The 51-day war was the worst so far. That's the regular procedure. Then comes the Western propaganda, just following Israeli Hasbara, exactly what you reported. Poor Israel is attacked by rockets. What can they do? They have to defend themselves.
Yeah, I think this was a very, very inspiring interview, just to say the least. And to the best of my knowledge, it was really educational because you get to learn a lot from it. But I would like to know what you guys think about it. So share your thoughts and opinion in the comment section below. And like always, we love hearing what you have to say. So thank you and see you in the next one.